In this unit and the next several units, we're going to be discussing personal identity, and we're going to be in particular looking at different theories of what personal identity is. In this unit, we'll get into what's called the soul theory of personal identity. But before we get to that, we're going to learn a little bit about what identity in general is and about why we should care about personal identity at all, and that's where we'll be starting this video. So a little bit of facts about me. I was born in San Diego. I mostly grew up outside of Boston with some time spent outside of Seattle. Eventually, I came to Los Angeles. I got my PhD at UCLA, and this is also where I met the woman who I eventually married and who became my wife. So looking over that history, there are some things that I'm proud of, like getting my PhD. And it's important that it's me that got the PhD, right? I'm not there are other people who I helped and who I was helped by, and I'm proud of those relationships. But it's me that was in those relationships, and that's why I'm proud of them. And it's my getting the PhD that I'm proud of. I'm not particular. There are lots of people who've gotten PhDs, and I'm happy for them. But I'm not proud of them in the way that I'm proud of myself for that accomplishment. And similarly, so it's important that it was me who, for my pride, it's important that it was me who got the PhD. And similarly, when I think about some of the ways in which I've treated people that I'm ashamed of and that I regret, it's important that it was me who did those things and not someone else. I'm not ashamed of other people's bad behavior. I'm ashamed of my past bad behavior. When I think about my wife, we have obligations to each other. We have those obligations because it was me and her who that long time ago got married, and so now it's me, the same person who then was married, and it's her, the same person now who was then married. So again, it's the same person in each of us. And again, when I think about my future, there are various things that I hope and wish for my future, and there are things that I want to happen to me and not to somebody else. So personal identity is woven through all of that, right? It's because it's me now and me then that I have pride and shame about things that happened in the past. It's because it's me now and me in the future that I have various wishes and hopes, and it's because it's me now who is the same person who was married way back then, and her now, and this is the same person who was married way back then, that we have those obligations to each other. So identity really matters a lot. It matters morally for what our obligations are and to whom. It matters for what we care about. So for our relationships, for our futures, and right, another thing, like, right, I'm scared of my death. It's my death, and I'm not as scared about other people's death. It's because it's going to happen to me. So when I ask myself, did I live a good life? It's did I live a good life, not did someone else live a good life. And that means I have to look across time and think there's this one person who all these different things happened to and did all these different things, and that makes up a life. It's a life that happened to one person. So we might ask, what makes me me over time? In many ways, I'm very different from who I was. I'm, for example, much bigger than I was as an infant, and my personality has changed to some extent, right? I have memories now that I didn't have then, and so on. And who I will be in the future is, again, in a lot of different ways different. And it's not just mentally different, but physically different. Almost all the cells in my body have changed out over time, and the same for you. You are now different than you were in a lot of ways, both mentally and physically. So who I was and who I will be, though, there's one person, the same person, who over time has different qualities. It's me, the one person that at the different times has the different qualities, and it's you that at different times has the different qualities. So your qualities change, and in some sense, you're thereby different. But which thing you are, that's remained the same because it's still you. So we want to know, what's the relationship between the past person, the present person, the future person that makes them all be the same person, even though some of the qualities have changed. So I want to be clear about this question about, more broadly, about sort of sameness and difference, that more generally, and how we're using those terms before we try to answer this question about past person, present person, future person that makes them the same. In what sense do we mean the same? So we can distinguish between what we call qualitative identity and numerical identity. Okay, so qualitative identity. Well, when we say that X is qualitatively identical to Y, what do we mean? We mean that X and Y have all the same qualities. So these rubber duckies, they have all the same qualities. They have the same size, they have the same shape, they have the same weight, they have the same different colors. So their qualities are all the same, but they're distinct entities, right? There are lots of them, in fact, but there could be just one, although actually there's lots of them. But the point is that they all have the same qualities. Each of them is qualitatively identical with itself, each thing has the same qualities as itself. But then also, each of them is in fact qualitatively identical with a whole bunch of other things because they all have the same qualities. Okay? So when we say that, so here we have, right, two of our rubber duckies. Each of them is qualitatively identical with itself, and they're qualitatively identical with each other as well, because they have all the same qualities. Each has the same qualities as itself, and each has the same qualities as the other. But there are things that are qualitatively distinct. So this toy boat is qualitatively identical with itself because it has all the same qualities as itself. But it's qualitatively distinct from both of the rubber duckies because it has different color, different shape, different size, different mass. It's just different. So when we say that x and y, or that x is qualitatively distinct from y, we mean that x and y have different qualities, and that means that they're also different entities. So now I want to talk about what we call numerical identity instead of qualitative identity. So this rubber ducky is each thing is numerically identical with itself and not numerically identical with anything else. So this rubber ducky, it's numerically identical with itself because it is itself. So when we say x is numerically identical with y, what we mean is that x and y are the same object. So we could say, we could give this rubber ducky two names. We could call it Bob and Ducky, and then we could say, yes, Bob is Ducky. Bob and Ducky are the same thing. There's just one thing there. We mean there's only one thing, Bob, i.e. Ducky. And we could also, another way of understanding that is to say that Bob, the name Bob and the name Ducky are names for the same thing, that one. When we can distinguish between, then we have the idea of numerically distinct. So here we have two rubber duckies, and each of them is numerically identical with itself because each thing is numerically identical with itself. Okay? But when we say that x is numerically distinct from y, we mean that x is not numerically identical with y. And we say that each thing is numerically identical with itself and nothing else. So these two rubber duckies, they are numerically distinct from each other, right? They are distinct objects. There are two of them. There's the one on the right and the one on the left. They're different. They're distinct objects. They're qualitatively identical, right? Because they have all the same qualities, but there are two of them, and the one is numerically distinct from the other. When we say numerically distinct, we mean there are two. And it's because if a numerical identity statement is true, we have only one object. And if we're talking about only one object. If we have a numerical distinctness statement, that's true, then we have two objects. That's why it's called numerical identity, because when it's true, we're talking about only one. When it's false, we're talking about two. And so it has to do with how many things there are, with numbers. So the two objects, they're numerically distinct from each other, but they're numerically distinct from each other, but they're qualitatively identical, and each is numerically identical with itself. And so when we have a numerically distinct statement, another way of thinking about that is it means that we have names for different objects. Okay, so we can think about how qualitative identity and numerical identity relate by looking at this grid. So in the upper left-hand corner, we have of the 4 in the bottom right hand. We have things that are we have an example of a situation where we have qualitative identity and numerical identity. Rubber ducky 1 and rubber ducky 1. Rubber ducky 1 is numerically identical with rubber ducky 1 because it's just the same thing. And of course, it's qualitatively identical with itself at any given time because whatever qualities it has, those are the ones that it has at that time. What about numerically distinct but qualitatively identical? Well, rubber ducky 1 and rubber ducky 2, they're numerically distinct because there are two of them, but they're qualitatively identical because they have all the same qualities. What about things that are qualitatively and numerically distinct? Bottom right-hand corner. Well, you and rubber ducky 1, you are qualitatively distinct from one another because there's rubber ducky 1 and you, different entities, different beings. And then you also have lots of different qualities, right? You are not a rubber ducky in any way. You're both physical, and that's probably mostly it. Many other ways, right? Very many different qualities. What about objects that are numerically identical but qualitatively distinct? Well, how about you right now, you as you are right now, and you as you were 5 years ago? Numerically identical, there's just one person, you, that's lasted over time, but qualitatively distinct because you have different qualities. And when we're interested in personal identity, what we want to know is, how can that be? How does it happen that it's the same being, the same entity over time that has different qualities? So let's take me. There's me as an infant, and there's me now as a teacher of this course. And I've changed in many ways, but it's still me, the same entity, the same being, in some sense the same person. And so we'll say numerically identical. What we have here are two pictures, or two icons, of the same thing, me. Okay. But there's a person who was the previous teacher of 101 online, and that person and me, as an infant, are distinct from one another. And that person and me now are numerically distinct from one another. So now I have some similarities with that person. We're both teachers of Philosophy 101 online. But those similarities are not enough to make us the same person, right? So what we want to know is then, so that we have there's this person who was born in San Diego, that's me, and who grew up in Seattle and Boston, and who is teaching this course, and that's all the same person. And then there's the person who taught this course online last semester, and that's a different person. And so what we want to know is what makes past me and now me numerically identical? What makes past me and now me be the same thing, the same person? Whereas we're both past me and present me are both distinct from the previous Philosophy 101 teacher. What are the relationships between past me and now me that are so important that distinguish the me from, say, the previous teacher of 101? Why is it, and another question is why, so we can think of it like this, why is it that it's only one thing through my history that's changed over time instead of there being a succession of multiple entities? So you could have maybe 3 different views or theories about this question. You could say, well, when is it the case that X is the same person as Y? What do we mean by that? Well, we might have the soul view. We might think there are these things called souls, and that X and Y have the same soul. Or we might have a view about bodies. We might say, oh, X and Y have the same body. Or we might have a view that's focused on personality. We might say that X's personality or X's psychology is closely connected to Y's. So we're going to be looking at these. They each need discussion, and we're going to be looking at them over the next several units. We're going to talk about the soul view in this module. And so in the next video for this unit, I'm going to start talking about what souls might be, and then we'll see whether or not we think the soul view is a good view of personal identity. That is, whether or not what makes me and infant me the same person is that we have the same soul, that there's some soul work that's lasted over time. We'll see about that view.